Good evening, everyone. It is a cloudy day in the year 1348 AD. You stand at the entrance of a small European town. Beneath your feet is a bumpy dirt road. An indescribable smell lingers in the air. You clutch a commission in your hand. It reads, "Congratulations. From this day forth, you are the town's official plague doctor." You gaze at the lopsided outlines of houses in the distance. The church bell tower looms faintly through the mist. That will be your new office, presumably. You lower your head to check the salary stated on the commission at the town gate. To be honest, it is quite good. Back then, the annual salary of an ordinary plague doctor was roughly equivalent to that of a minor noble. In some cities, the pay was even 4 times that of a regular physician. A minor town official has come to meet you. He stands about 3 meters away from you. He speaks while covering his nose with his sleeve. He leads you down a narrow alley to your workplace, a small stone hut. Its windows are as narrow as arrow slits. On the table inside lies a set of gear, a waxed long robe, a wide-brimmed hat, a pair of gloves, a long wooden stick, and a beak-shaped mask. You pick up the mask and heft it. It is quite heavy, about half an arm's length. Its curved beak has an obscene look to it. You lean in to smell it. There is a strong mixed fragrance, as if someone has mixed a pharmacy and a flower shop together. Though the image of the plague doctor looks like a prop from a horror movie today. Back then, these were officially certified medical workers. In addition to treating the sick, plague doctors back then had another important duty: recording the number of deaths. You are both a doctor and a census taker, except you count the dead. In some cities, plague doctors even had the legal right to witness the last wills and testaments of the deceased. This was a considerable legal privilege at the time. So in a sense, you are not just a doctor, but also half a notary public. The minor official hands you a thin manual with some simple operating guidelines: how to approach patients, how to check symptoms, how to keep records. You flip through it and find that the most practical piece of advice is simply to keep your distance. You put the mask back on the table, walk to the small window and look out. There is hardly anyone walking in the alley. Only a gaunt cat crouching at the base of a wall. The church bell chimes in the distance, but it is not the cheerful peal of a Sunday service. It tolls slowly, heavily, as if counting something. You take a deep breath, tuck the manual into your pocket, and know that tomorrow you will put on that beak and start your work for real. You are woken up by a knock on the door at dawn. It is the same minor official from yesterday. He says a family on the east side of the town needs your attention. You rub your eyes, walk to the table, and pick up the beak mask. You turn it over. There is a small compartment inside the beak stuffed to the brim. You poke at the contents and make out a few things: dried rose petals, a few cloves, a pinch of ambergris, and some herbal crumbs you cannot name. At the very end of the beak, right near where your nostrils would be, there is also a small sponge soaked in vinegar. Back then, people firmly believed in a theory called miasma. Simply put, bad air caused disease. They thought the plague spread because a toxic stench lingered in the air. A stench emanating from rotting organic matter, marshes, or even the alignment of the planets. Shh, So the core strategy to fight the plague was, don't let yourself smell the stench. And thus, the beak mask was born. That long beak was not for show, nor to scare people. It was to create a distance between you and the toxic air, and to make every breath you take pass through the filter of those spices first. Instead of the stench of death, you smell a mobile garden. You put on the mask and adjust the straps. Your field of vision narrows at once. You can only see through two small round glass holes. The world becomes two blurry circles. The weight of the beak presses on your bridge of the nose and cheekbones, uncomfortable, but the rich floral fragrance is quite invigorating. Fully dressed, you step outside and take your first steps on the town's streets. A woman carrying a basin of water sees you from afar and immediately turns around and hurries away. Two children playing with pebbles at the alley mouth scream and run off at the sight of your shadow. Even a dog dozing by the roadside looks up at you, then slinks away with its tail between its legs. You grip your wooden stick tightly and head toward the east side of the town. The stick is about an arm and a half long, with a slightly curved tip. It can be used to lift a patient's clothes, to check symptoms, to knock on doors, and even to push away anyone who gets too close and enthusiastic. The floral fragrance in the beak mask sways gently with your steps. You start to get used to seeing the world through two round holes. Sunlight breaks through the clouds and shines on the flagstones, stretching your shadow long and thin. The pointed outline of your head makes you look like a huge, slow-moving raven. Before you reach the family on the east side, you meet a merchant coming from the south on the way. He is sitting on a stone by the roadside, pale-faced, talking to an old bread seller. You listen for a while and piece together a chilling picture. The plague did not fall from the sky. It traveled along trade routes. The merchant says he traveled north all the way from Genoa, and people were dying in every port along the way. The first news came from the east, from the city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, a trading post run by the Genoese. Around 1346, as the Mongol army besieged the city, the plague broke out in their camp. It is said the Mongols catapulted the bodies of those who died from the plague over the city walls. This may be one of the earliest cases of biological warfare in human history. Whether the story of Kaffa is true or not, one thing is certain. Genoese merchant ships brought the plague to the Mediterranean. In October 1347, several ships from the east docked at the port of Messina on Sicily. Most of the sailors on board were already sick, some even dead. The people of the port initially tried to drive the ships away, but it was too late. The pathogen had already set foot on land. From Messina, the plague spread along the coastline at an astonishing speed. It first reached Marseille, then Venice and Florence, before crossing the Alps into the German states, marching north to England and Scandinavia, and even as far as Iceland. In just 45 years, it spread across nearly the entire Europe. As you listen to the merchant's account, a map takes shape in your mind. The plague's mode of spread is crystal clear. It followed the people. Where there were ports, where there were trade routes, that was the next place to fall. Remote inland villages were often the last to be hit, while prosperous commercial cities fell first. The merchant finishes speaking, stands up, brushes the dust off his trousers, and continues north. The old bread seller silently packs up his stall. He has not sold a single loaf of bread. You notice he walks around the stone the merchant sat on when packing up, as if the stone itself could spread the plague. In fact, people back then had no knowledge of microorganisms, but many intuitively realized one thing: the disease was related to contact. They could not explain why, but they observed that those who cared for the sick were more likely to fall ill, and those who had been to a patient's home were more likely to collapse. This simple empirical observation later gave birth to some of the most important public health measures in human history. Though their explanation was that you had come close to the source of the miasma, at least they got half the action right. You continue eastward. The sunlight has broken through the clouds completely, making the puddles on the flagstones glint. You notice red cross marks on the doors of several houses along the road, a sign that there is a patient inside, or has been one. The red crosses are silent warnings, telling people to stay away. You glance down at the wooden stick in your hand, then keep walking. It is behind those doors marked with red crosses that you are heading. You stand at the door. The red cross on the wooden door is not yet dry, the paint dripping a little down the grain, looking as if it is weeping. You take a deep breath. The rose petals in the beak seem to have been changed today, their scent fresher than yesterday's. Then you knock on the door with your stick. The door opens a crack from the inside. A woman's face appears, her eyes red, her expression the calm of someone who has cried all their tears away. She sees your beak mask, but unlike the people on the street, she does not draw back. Instead, she opens the door a little wider. The room is dim, only a sliver of light coming through the window. Hay covers the floor, and in the corner is a simple wooden bed, on which a man is lying. You take a step closer, first probing the way with your stick. Then you see the symptoms. A few obvious swellings have formed on one side of the man's neck and under his armpits, about the size of eggs. These swellings are the most typical sign of bubonic plague. The buboes, that gave the Black Death its name. Some say the term Black Death comes from these swellings, which eventually turn a deep purple or black. However, later scholars believe the name Black Death was not actually used until much later. People in the 14th century mostly called it the Great Plague or the Great Mortality. You lift the man's collar gently with your stick, observing the size and color of the swellings. As a plague doctor, your diagnostic tools are extremely limited, mainly just looking and asking, occasionally feeling a pulse, but you avoid even touching the patient most of the time. The wooden stick in your hand is both an examination tool and the only physical barrier between you and the patient. You ask a few questions. When did you start feeling unwell? The man's wife replies, about 3 days ago, first a headache, then a fever, and then the swellings appeared on his neck. You ask if he has been outside lately. The woman shakes her head. No, but he had been helping unload goods at the dock a while ago. Again the dock. You jot down the details in your pocket notebook. You need to record each patient's symptoms, address, and recent contacts, then report regularly to the town's magistrate. Back then, plague doctors also carried a substance called plague vinegar on their initial visits, a liquid made by steeping various herbs in vinegar. The recipe varied by region, but common ingredients included rosemary, sage, lavender, and garlic. Doctors would use it to wipe their gloves and sticks, and sometimes sprinkle it on the ground around the patient. Though plague vinegar was invented based on the incorrect miasma theory. Vinegar itself does have some disinfectant properties. You finish the examination, jot down all you can, then tell the family to close the door and not let anyone else in, to burn aromatic wood or spices in the house to purify the air, and to pray. As you turn to leave, the woman calls out to you. She asks if he will get better. You look at her through the mask and pause. You do not answer the question. You just leave a small packet of herbs on the stone step at the door, telling her to steep it in hot water for the patient to drink. Then you walk out. The sunlight stings your eyes sharply. After leaving the family's house, you return to your small hut and flip through the thick medical manual on the table. You want to see if there are any decent treatments for this disease. The most authoritative medical texts in Europe at the time were still based on ancient Greek and Roman theories, centered on the concept of the four humours. This theory held that the human body was composed of four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness occurred when these four humours lost their balance. So the core idea of treatment was to find a way to restore that balance. The first remedy recorded in the manual is as follows. Take fresh rose water, add a little ambergris and a pinch of crushed pearl powder, mix them together, and have the patient drink it. This recipe is said to come from the works of an Arab physician. Ambergris was thought to have exorcising properties, while pearl powder could calm the mind. The second remedy is where it starts to get absurd. Cut open a live chicken and press it directly onto the patient's lymph node swellings. The theoretical basis was that the chicken's body heat could draw the toxins out of the body. The third remedy is ground emerald powder. It was said that gemstones contained natural essence and energy, and green represented life and vitality. So emerald powder was the best choice to fight death. You keep flipping and find more eye-opening suggestions. Burn aloe in the room to purify the air. Make a poultice of hot figs and boiled onions and apply it to the swellings. Have the patient sit between two large fires to sweat out the toxins. There is even a suggestion to rub mercury on the skin, because mercury's fluidity could help unblock the stagnation of the humours. You close the manual silently and glance at the beak mask again. Tomorrow, you will have to make your rounds again. Early the next morning, you receive a new order. Go to a barber shop on the west side of the town to assist with a bloodletting procedure. In the Middle Ages, the line between barbers and surgeons was extremely blurry. Many low-level surgical procedures, lancing abscesses, pulling teeth, bloodletting, were performed by barbers. This is why, to this day, barber shops in many countries still hang a red, white, and blue striped barber pole outside. The red on the pole represents blood, the white represents bandages, and there are different theories about what the blue stands for. Some say it is for veins, others that it is purely decorative. You push open the door of the barber shop and see a burly man with a full beard, the barber, and half a surgeon. On his workbench are neatly laid out a few blades, next to a copper basin with faintly reddish water inside. Bloodletting was one of the most mainstream medical practices in the Middle Ages, used for almost all illnesses. The core logic was still the four humours theory. If disease was caused by an imbalance of the humours, then letting out the excess blood would restore that balance. The barber first looks at the patient, a pale young apprentice, and ties a leather strap around his arm to make the veins stand out. Then he picks up a small blade called a lancet and makes a gentle cut on a vein in the apprentice's arm. Blood slowly starts to flow into the copper basin. You observe from the side, silently counting the amount of blood being let. Medieval medical theory held that the amount and timing of bloodletting had to be determined based on the patient's constitution, the zodiac, and the phases of the moon. Many medieval bloodletting manuals were accompanied by a bloodletting man, a diagram marking which parts of the human body corresponded to the 12 signs of the zodiac, telling you where to let blood during which lunar phases. For example, it was not advisable to let blood from the head when the moon was in Aries, and not to cut the feet when the moon was in Pisces. This system was called medical astrology, and it was a serious academic field at the time. Besides bloodletting with blades, another very popular method was using leeches. People back then thought medical leeches were milder and more natural than blades, because they would choose the spot to suck blood and the amount on their own. In a way, people regarded leeches as a form of intelligent medical equipment. In some cities, there were even specialized leech shops, just like modern pharmacies. After being used, leeches were usually placed in salt water to make them regurgitate the blood, then cleaned for reuse. Halfway through the bloodletting, you notice the apprentice's face has turned even paler. The barber slaps the apprentice's cheek, presses a cloth on the cut, and announces that the bloodletting for the day is over. The apprentice slumps weakly in the chair, like a fish with its bones pulled out. You jot down the procedure in your notebook, then turn and leave the barber shop. The red and white pole outside spins slowly in the corner of your eye. You suddenly have a strange feeling. Being a doctor in this era is not the hardest part when facing the disease itself, but when facing an entire system of theories that you know is not quite right, yet everyone firmly believes in. You cannot change anything alone. All you can do is try to do as little harm as possible. This may be the longest detour in the history of medicine, but this is how humanity stumbles forward. You walk back and see the apprentice who just had bloodletting being helped out of the barber shop, his face as pale as an unbaked loaf of bread. You silently wish him well, hoping he can drink a couple of bowls of thick congee tonight to make up for what he has lost. That evening, you receive a letter from Venice, delivered by a disinfected messenger. It bears the seal of the Doge of Venice, and its contents make you stop in your tracks. Venice, the busiest trading port in all of Europe, had made an unprecedented decision. All ships coming from plague-stricken areas must remain at sea for 40 days before being allowed to dock. The Italian word for 40 days later evolved into a word we all know very well today: quarantine. The modern concept of quarantine traces its direct etymology to this 40-day policy of medieval Venice. In fact, Venice was not the first city to implement quarantine measures. In 1377, the present-day Dubrovnik in Croatia had already passed a law requiring travelers from plague areas to stay in a designated place outside the city. for 30 days. Venice extended this to 40 days on that basis. Some believe this is related to the symbolic meaning of the number 40 in Christian tradition. For example, Jesus fasted for 40 days in the wilderness, and the Great Flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights. Others think it was based on practical observation, because people at the time found that if no symptoms appeared after about 40 days, the person was basically safe. After reading the letter, you feel a touch of admiration for the Venetians. In an era when no one understood how disease spread, they had come up with a fairly reliable public health system through empirical observation and administrative efficiency. And Venice's quarantine system was far more than just a 40-day wait at sea. They also built dedicated quarantine islands. Lazaretto Nuovo, an island in the Venetian lagoon, was designated as a quarantine zone. All suspected infected persons were sent there, with basic living facilities and medical staff on the island. Though the conditions were harsh, this concept concentrating suspected cases in an isolated place for observation was the very prototype of the modern quarantine hospital. You fold the letter and tuck it into your pocket, then walk to the window and look out at the street. The small town you are in does not have as many resources as Venice, nor such a sophisticated administrative system, but you notice that the townspeople are also taking some similar measures on their own initiative. Some families have sealed all their doors and windows, leaving only a small hole to receive food. Some merchants have stopped receiving guests from other places. The church has suspended mass gatherings for worship. No one has issued an order, no one has enacted a law, but people's instincts tell them to stay away from crowds, stay away from the sick, and lock themselves inside. These instincts are correct, though they cannot name concepts like droplet transmission or contact infection, though they attribute the cause to miasma or God's punishment. In action, many of the choices they make point in the right direction. You turn from the window and start preparing your medical bag for tomorrow's rounds. Vinegar, herbs, clean cloths, and the wooden stick you never leave home without. You pack the bag and place it by the door, then blow out the oil lamp. The last ray of sunlight fades behind the distant mountain ridge. The town falls silent, an unnatural silence. Not the peace of calm, but the silence of everyone huddling behind their doors, holding their breath. You are woken up by a commotion early on the third day. This is unusual. The town has been almost silent these past few days, and now it is suddenly bustling. Either the plague has receded, or something else has happened. You quickly put on your gear, slip on the beak mask, and step outside. The scene on the street stops you in your tracks. About 30 or 40 people are marching in a single file from the south gate of the town. They wear rough white robes and bare feet, each holding a leather whip with a spiked or knotted end. As they walk, they sing a mournful hymn. Their white robes are stained with dark red marks. They are flagellants, or self-flagellating penitents. This group grew rapidly during the Black Death, spreading from the German states across Europe. Their core belief was that the Black Death was God's punishment for humanity's sins, and the only way to appease God's wrath was to atone through public self-flagellation. A typical flagellant ritual usually lasted 33.5 days, symbolizing the 33.5 years Jesus spent on earth. During this time, participants would perform public flagellation 2 or 3 times a day. You stand by the roadside and watch them pass. Though the flagellant movement was a spontaneous religious act on the surface, it was actually quite well organized. They had their own constitution, initiation rituals, and hierarchy. Participants had to swear obedience to their leaders, pay an initiation fee, and refrain from bathing, changing clothes, and speaking to the opposite sex during the 33.5 days of penance. The flagellants procession passes through the town square and stops in front of the church. They form a circle and begin a more intense ritual. Of the onlookers, some kneel and pray, some shed silent tears, and some just stand there, staring in dumbfounded amazement. You watch them walk round and round in front of the church, the crack of the whips cutting through the air mixing with the distant church bells, creating a strange soundscape that is hard to describe as either solemn or sad. You turn and leave the square. You still have patience to see. As you walk out of the square, you glance back one last time. The flagellants are now on their knees, their hands stretched toward the sky, chanting the same Latin prayer over and over again. The crowd of onlookers has grown even larger. Some people bring out food and water from their homes and place them on the roadside for the flagellants to take. You quicken your pace. The flagellants' singing fades into a low hum behind you. Not far from the square, you smell smoke. Not the wood smoke of a fireplace, nor the acrid stench of burning garbage. This smoke is thicker and more complex, as if something that should not be burned is mixed in it. You quicken your steps, turn a corner, and see a sight that tightens your chest. In the southwest corner of the town, the Jewish quarter, several houses are billowing with smoke. It is not a fire, but someone has lit large bonfires in front of the houses. A mob of angry people has gathered outside, shouting at the doors and windows. You ask a blacksmith nearby and piece together the situation. A rumor has spread that the Jews have poisoned the wells, that this is the real source of the plague. The rumor of Jewish well poisoning is one of the darkest byproducts of the Black Death. In the years when the plague swept Europe, countless Jewish communities were subjected to violent attacks, from southern France to the Rhine Valley, from Spain to the Polish border. People needed an explanation. Why did the plague come? Why did my family have to die? Since God did not answer, they found a visible scapegoat. Soon, people claimed to have seen Jews putting some kind of powder or liquid into the well water. Some said suspicious medicine bags had been found in Jewish homes. Worse still, under torture, some Jews were forced to confess. And these confessions obtained through coercion were used as evidence for more massacres. You stand on that smoky street corner, watching the angry mob, knowing you cannot change anything. A plague doctor has neither the power nor the influence to do so. But you notice an ironic detail. The mortality rate in some Jewish communities was actually lower than in the surrounding areas. This was not because they poisoned the wells or had some secret cure, but more likely due to their living habits. Jewish purity laws required more frequent hand washing and stricter food hygiene standards. practices that objectively may have reduced the risk of contracting certain infectious diseases. You finally turn and leave that street corner saying nothing, doing nothing. The floral fragrance in the beak mask suddenly feels empty. Back in your hut, you record what you saw today in your notebook. Your pen pauses at the last line. You want to write some comment, but in the end, you just draw a period. You set the notebook down and walk to the window. It is getting dark. The church bell tolls again in the distance, this time for evening prayers. The bell rings spread through the air, drowning out everything. The still smouldering houses, the still angry shouts, and the indescribable weight in your heart. The last glimmer of daylight outside fades away. You blow out the oil lamp and lie down on the bed. By the time the sun rises, you are already on your way to make your rounds. You have a long walk today. Several farms on the outskirts of the town have also reported cases. You walk along the country path and notice that the crop fields by the roadside are almost empty of people. Fields that should have been bustling at this time of year are now silent, except for the wind and the chirping of insects. Occasionally, you see a few rats scurrying out of the grass. Fast, their small grey figures flashing away in an instant. In this era, rats are just an ordinary pest, no one drawing any connection between them and the plague. But the pathogen of the Black Death is a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which mainly parasitizes rodents such as rats. When a rat is infected with Yersinia pestis, the fleas on its body also become infected while feeding on its blood. When the host rat dies, the fleas, having lost their food source, jump onto the nearest warm-blooded animal, and more often than not, that nearest warm-blooded animal is a human being. As the flea bites the human, it injects Yersinia pestis into their bloodstream, and the infection begins. You step on something soft on the road. You look down and see a dead rat. You nudge it into the grass by the roadside with your stick, paying it little mind. If you knew there was an invisible causal chain between this tiny creature and the swollen lymph nodes you face every day, you might have looked at it a little longer. But in this era, you cannot see it. After all, the truth is hidden under a microscope. 500 years in the future, you reach the gate of the first farm. The yard is empty, only a few chickens pecking at the ground. You knock on the door and wait for a moment before it opens. You step inside and find the situation is even more severe than in the town. Rural medical resources are even scarcer than in the city. Money farmers have never even heard of a plague doctor. Basically, all they can rely on is the village midwife. In medieval rural areas, the midwife was often the only person with any kind of medical knowledge. Her duties extended far beyond childbirth. She also handled all manner of daily injuries and illnesses. During the plague, many midwives took on the initial diagnosis and care of patients, and a considerable number of them contracted the plague as a result. You stay at the farm for most of the day, doing all you can, recording, examining, leaving herbs and advice. When you leave, the farmer's wife shoves a small piece of cheese and a few apples into your hands as a thank you gift. You accept them. In these times of scarcity, food is perhaps the most sincere form of currency. On the way back, you see a few more rats scurrying out of the cracks of a granary by the roadside. The setting sun gilds their grey fur, making them look almost cute. You do not think much of it and keep walking. The sky clouds over on your way back from the farm. You walk slowly, your mind filled with the faces you saw today. As you near the town, you meet a traveller coming from the south. He is not a merchant, but more of a scholar. His clothes are plain but well tailored, and he carries a leather satchel full of scrolls and books. You walk with him for a while, and he tells you he has just come from Florence. Florence, one of the most prosperous cities in Italy at the time, was also one of the first places to be hit hard by the plague. In the spring of 1348, the plague broke out in full force in Florence, claiming roughly half or more of the city's population in just a few months. The traveler tells you something that sticks with you. On the outskirts of Florence, a group of young nobles, 7 young women and 3 young men, fled the city at the height of the plague and took refuge in a country villa. They quarantined themselves there, and each day took turns telling stories to pass the time. For 10 days, each of the 10 told 1 story a day, for a total of 100 stories. This is the framework of Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron. Boccaccio wrote this work roughly between 1349 and 1353. It is not only a pinnacle of medieval literature, but also a mirror for understanding the social mentality of the Black Death era. The 100 stories in the book cover all aspects of human nature: love, desire, deceit, wisdom, foolishness, greed, generosity. And wrapping these stories is a stunning depiction of Florence during the plague. The traveller bids you farewell at the town entrance, saying he will continue north to find a safe place. You watch his figure grow smaller and smaller, then disappear around a bend. You suddenly think that maybe one day, Simona will write a story about everything you are going through now. Maybe hundreds of years from now, Simone will lie in a warm room you cannot imagine, listening to a voice you cannot imagine, telling the story of what you saw today slowly. You shake your head, thinking you are overthinking it. But then you think again. In fact, people around you are already doing something similar. In the scriptoriums of various monasteries and churches, there are people quietly and persistently recording everything that is happening during the plague. These chroniclers are monks, priests, and a small number of literate townsfolk. With a quill and ink, they write down the number of deaths, strange events, social unrest, and personal joys and sorrows in Latin or local dialects. Many chroniclers die halfway through their writing, and the handwriting in the last few lines of some manuscripts becomes shaky, then stops abruptly, the rest of the page blank. These blank spaces are perhaps the most silent and powerful testimonies of the entire Black Death era. There was an Irish Franciscan friar named Clean, who kept a record of the plague's progress in a monastery in Kilkenny. At the end of his manuscript, he wrote that he left the parchment hoping that someone would continue his record. Then his handwriting stops. Later, another hand added a short note below his words, roughly meaning that the author seems to have died here. You walk slowly back to your hut along the alley. The moon peeks out from behind the clouds, casting your shadow on the stone wall, long like an unfinished story. Days pass, and you gradually get used to the rhythm of making your rounds, putting on the mask, and going out in the morning. walking between door after door marked with red crosses during the day, coming back to sort out your records in the evening. But you start to notice that besides the disease itself, other changes are taking place in the world, changes that, though not as dramatic as the plague, are far more profound. The first and most obvious change is a shortage of labor. So far, your small town has lost nearly a third of its population. There are barely enough people to fill some professions. 2 bakers are gone, leaving only an old man struggling to keep his shop open. The blacksmith is dead, and one of his apprentices has run away. 2 of the 3 priests in the church have left, the remaining one busy from dawn till dusk, with masses, last rites, and funerals filling his schedule. On a European scale, this phenomenon is even more staggering. The Black Death claimed roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's population in its first major outbreak. It is difficult to estimate the exact death toll, as medieval population records are extremely incomplete, and different scholars using different estimation methods arrive at widely varying figures. But whether it is 30% or 60%, one thing is clear: the labor force has plummeted. And when the labor force shrinks, the living become valuable. Before the Black Death, Europe's feudal society relied heavily on serfdom. A large number of peasants were tied to the lord's land, farming for generations, with no right to free movement and little bargaining power. But after the plague, everything changed. The land remained the same, but half the farmers were gone. Lords suddenly found they could no longer exploit their serfs as they pleased, because the serfs could threaten to leave. If you do not give me better conditions, I will go to the neighboring manor. They are short of hands too. Wages started to rise, not just for agricultural workers, but for all labor-intensive trades: construction, textiles, metalworking. In some areas, wages doubled or tripled after the plague. For the lower classes of laborers, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But for the nobles and large landowners, it was the end of the world. So the powerful did something classic in history. They tried to freeze wages with laws. England enacted the Statute of Labourers in 1351, stipulating that wages could not exceed pre-plague levels, and that workers could not leave their original employers without permission. Similar laws were soon introduced in France, Spain, Italy, and other places, but with little effect. You cannot fight the basic laws of supply and demand with a single piece of legislation. Many workers ignored the laws and changed jobs for higher pay anyway. Besides the labor market, you also notice other changes. More people in the town are starting to learn Latin and arithmetic subjects that were once the exclusive domain of priests and nobles. But now that there are fewer students in schools, the church has begun to expand its enrollment to keep running. Because there are not enough hands, they have to find more efficient tools and methods to make up for it. You walk back to your small hut in the twilight, your notebook filled with dense data from the day. You think that maybe years later, Simone will open these records and see not just numbers of death, but the process of an old world collapsing and a new world emerging from the ruins. But that is all in the future. Tonight, you just want to take off the beak mask, drink a bowl of hot soup, and close your eyes. Before you close your eyes, fragments of observation flit through your mind. You notice that women's social roles in the town are also quietly changing. In the past, money trades, brewing, textiles, even some commercial activities were strictly restricted to men by guilds. But now that so many men have died, the guild rules have naturally loosened. Some widows have taken over their husbands' workshops, and some women have begun to enter professions that were once closed to them. Whether this change is temporary or permanent varies by region, but it at least shows one thing. When there are not enough people to enforce the old order itself begins to fray. You have lost count of how many months you have been a plague doctor. The seasons have turned full circle. When you first arrived, the trees still had leaves. Then the leaves fell, the snow came and melted, and now new leaves are growing again. And one morning, as you step outside, you suddenly realize something. Shh, there are people on the street. Not people hurrying by with their heads down, but people actually standing on the street. Even two people stopping to chat at the door of the bread shop. The old bread seller has even set up his stall again, with a few freshly baked loaves on it, steaming hot. You walk over. The old man sees your beak mask, hesitates for a moment, then breaks into a somewhat forced but genuine smile. He says it seems fewer people are getting sick lately. He is right, and as you flip through your recent records, the number of new cases is indeed dropping. The plague is not a lamp with a switch that someone can flip to turn it off. It fades like a slow rolling tide. A few fewer cases this week than last. A few fewer last week than the week before. You make your final round of visits, walking especially slowly this time, not out of tiredness, but because you want to take a good look at this small town you have come to know so well. Some of the doors marked with red crosses have had the paint faded by rain, revealing the wood grain underneath. Some doors are open again, with washed clothes hanging out to dry at the entrance. Some doors will never open again. Their owners are all gone, in one way or another. You pass the barber shop. The red and white pole is still there, but the barber has changed. A young man has taken over, his hands still unsteady. You pass the church. Simone has added a small new fresco, a golden angel with outstretched wings, holding a lily in its hand. You pass the Jewish quarter. The burned houses still stand, their blackened walls like a scar, but a few nearby houses have started to be repaired. Simone is laying new tiles on the roof. You finally walk to the outskirts of the town, standing on the dirt road you first took on your first day here. There are figures in the fields now, not many, but a farmer is slowly herding a cow in the distance, ploughing a field that has been left fallow for a long time. As the clods of earth turn over, you can smell the damp, vibrant scent of the soil. You stand by the roadside for a while, watching the farmer's figure shrink to a small silhouette in the dusk, then turn and walk back into the town. Tonight, you decide to give yourself half a day off. You walk into the bread shop and buy a hot loaf of bread. This time, the old man does not hesitate, handing it directly to you, even though you are still wearing gloves. It is a rye bread, its crust baked crisp, the inside still steaming. You sit on a bench outside the bread shop, take off the mask, and take a bite. That simple, warm taste with a hint of sourness spreads in your mouth. It has been a long time since you have eaten anything outside, in the sunlight, without the mask on. You chew and watch the people coming and going on the street. Not many, but they are indeed coming and going. An old woman sits on the steps across the way, basking in the sun, a basket of wool beside her. Two young boys chase a dog at the alley mouth, the dog's tail wagging cheerfully. A peddler pushing a handcart passes in front of you, it loaded with earthen jars and squash, its wheels creaking on the flagstones. These scenes are ordinary on any other day, but at this moment, every frame feels as precious as the stained glass in a church. You finish the bread, brush the crumbs off your hands, and stand up. You think maybe tomorrow you can go out without the mask. Maybe in a few days you can put the waxed robe away too. Maybe after a while you will find another job. The town is being rebuilt and hands are needed everywhere. But not today. Today, one hot loaf of bread is enough. The last patient under your care is discharged. He sits up from the bed, drinks a bowl of congee, then steps out into the sunlight at the door. There are still faint marks on his neck from the faded swellings, but colour has returned to his face. He nods at you. You nod back. Two people, one wearing a beak mask, the other with a scar on his neck, standing in front of a lopsided door frame. This is perhaps the closest thing to a perfect moment in all this time. You return to your hut, take off your gloves, hang the long robe behind the door, then pick up the beak mask and heft it. It is still just as heavy. The petals and spices are in need of changing, but you stare at the mask for a long time anyway. This mask has walked with you behind every door marked with a red cross, has bent with you as you recorded every set of numbers, has stood with you in silence on that smoky street corner. It protected you. At least, you believe it did. You hang the mask on a nail on the wall, beak pointing down. Its two glass eye holes glint for a moment in the light of the oil lamp, as if blinking. You sit in the small hut, the oil lamp's flame flickering gently. The sky outside darkens gradually, and the first star appears beside the outline of the church bell tower. You take the notebook filled with data out of your pocket, flip to the last page, hesitate for a moment, and write a sentence. Not a number, not a symptom, not an address, just an ordinary sentence. You write, "The bread shop opened today." Then you close the notebook and place it on the table, next to the beak mask, a book filled with numbers of death, and a mask stuffed with flower petals lying side by side on an old wooden table. They are perhaps the two most faithful witnesses to this experience. You walk to the window and push open the small arrow slit-like window. The evening breeze blows in, carrying the scent of spring soil. Someone is singing in the distance. Not a hymn, not a dirge, just an ordinary folk song about spring and girls. It is not sung well, but that does not matter. What matters is that someone is singing, and they are singing a song about living. You lean against the window frame and let the wind blow for a while. There is no beak mask on your face now, your skin touching the air directly. There is no fragrance of flower petals or cloves in the air. Just ordinary evening breeze, tinged with a little smoke and fire. But it smells better than any spice in the world.